Hey guys, tonight we're exploring one of the most terrifying experiences in medieval history. Not a battle that lasts an hour, not a plague that kills in days, but a siege. A slow, grinding, months-long nightmare that turns entire cities into open-air prisons where starvation, disease, and madness compete to see which kills you first. Because while Hollywood makes sieges look like epic battles with heroic last stands, the reality is far more horrifying. Most people didn't die gloriously defending the walls. They died slowly, miserably, forgotten in dark corners, their bodies adding to the growing pile of reasons why the city stank of death. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up to a sound you've never heard before. It's not the usual morning bells from the cathedral, not the clatter of cartwheels on cobblestone, not even the shouts of merchants setting up their stalls. It's deeper, more rhythmic, like thunder, but thunder that refuses to stop. You stumble to your window, still groggy, still hoping this is just another ordinary day in your ordinary medieval life. But as you peer through the wooden shutters, your blood turns cold. On the horizon, stretching as far as you can see, is an army. Not a few dozen soldiers or a small raiding party, but thousands upon thousands of men. Their banners snap in the wind like hungry mouths. Their armor glints in the early morning sun like the scales of some massive predatory beast. And between their ranks, you can make out the silhouettes of things that shouldn't exist. Wooden towers that rival the height of your city's cathedral. Massive catapults with arms as long as tree trunks. And something else. Something that makes your stomach drop to your knees. The siege engines are moving toward your city walls. You're not a soldier. You're not a knight with training and armor and a noble cause. You're just a person. Maybe a baker or a blacksmith or a seamstress. Someone who thought the thick stone walls surrounding your city meant safety. Someone who believed that as long as you stayed inside, as long as you kept your head down and minded your own business, the wars and conflicts of the great lords would pass you by like storms in the distance. You were wrong. The storm is here, and you're trapped inside it. The rhythmic thunder grows louder, and now you can identify what it is. Drums. War drums beating in perfect unison. Thousands of them, creating a sound that seems to come from the earth itself. It's not just noise, it's a message. We are here. We are many. We are patient. And we're not leaving until everyone inside these walls is either dead or begging for mercy. Welcome to a medieval siege, where survival isn't measured in hours or days, but in months. Where the enemy doesn't just want to defeat you, they want to break you so completely that surrender becomes a mercy, where the walls that were supposed to protect you become the bars of the world's largest, slowest, most agonizing prison. And here's the thing that would shock you most about medieval sieges. The enemy outside isn't your biggest threat. Sure, they've got catapults and battering rams and enough soldiers to darken the countryside, but they're not the ones who are going to kill you. The real killers are already inside the walls with you. Hunger, disease, desperation, fear, and time, which in a siege isn't healing anything. It's rotting everything, including your chances of survival. Let's start with what you're facing. The army outside isn't just a bunch of angry peasants with pitchforks. Medieval siege warfare was a science, a brutal, methodical science that had been refined over centuries of war. The commanders outside your walls have done this before. They know exactly how long it takes to starve a city. They know which diseases spread fastest in cramped, unsanitary conditions. They know how to break not just walls, but the human spirit. The siege begins not with an assault, but with isolation. Every road leading to your city is blocked. Every messenger who tries to leave is caught, and if you're lucky, simply killed. If you're not lucky, they're sent back missing pieces of themselves. A preview of what's coming for everyone else. Your city, which yesterday was connected to the wider world through trade routes and travelers, is now completely alone, cut off, forgotten by everyone except the people who want you dead. Food stops coming in. This seems obvious, but you probably never thought about how much food a medieval city actually needs. If you live in a city of 10,000 people, you need roughly 20,000 pounds of grain every single day just to keep everyone alive. Not well fed, not happy, just breathing. And that's assuming everyone gets barely enough to survive. Your city's granaries might have enough food for a few weeks, maybe a month if you're incredibly lucky and the harvest was good. After that, you're eating bark, leather, and each other. Water becomes precious in ways you never imagined. Sure, your city has wells, and maybe a cistern or two, but water isn't just for drinking. You need it for cooking the increasingly creative meals you'll be making from things that were never meant to be food. You need it for trying to stay clean, which becomes almost impossible when the city's sanitation systems start breaking down. And you need it for putting out the fires, because the army outside is going to be lobbing flaming projectiles over your walls for months. But here's what really makes a siege terrifying. Time works against you in every possible way. Every day that passes, you get weaker. Every day that passes, your food supplies get smaller. Every day that passes, more people get sick. Meanwhile, the army outside gets stronger. More troops arrive. More siege engines are built. More supplies are brought up from friendly territory. They're fighting on their own schedule, while you're fighting against a clock that's counting down to your death. And the psychological warfare starts immediately. This isn't just about starving you out. It's about breaking your mind. During the siege of Antioch in 1098, the attackers would parade captured defenders in front of the walls, torturing them slowly enough that their screams could be heard throughout the city. They wanted everyone inside to know exactly what was waiting for them if the walls fell. At the siege of Carcassonne in 1209, the attackers poisoned the wells outside the city and then allowed refugees to drink from them, sending the bodies floating down the river that ran through the city. The message was clear. This is what happens to anyone who opposes us. Sleep becomes impossible, not just because of the noise, though the enemy makes sure there's plenty of that. Drums beating all night, horns blowing at random intervals, soldiers shouting threats and insults. But also because of the waiting. Every creak of the walls makes you wonder if this is the moment they finally break through. Every shadow makes you wonder if someone has already breached the defenses. Every silence makes you wonder if they're tunneling underneath your house right now. You start to realize that the thick stone walls you trusted aren't just protection. They're also a trap. There's no running away from a siege. There's no escaping to fight another day. You're committed now, whether you want to be or not. You're going to see this through to the end. And the end is going to be very ugly for most of the people reading this. The social order inside the city starts to change within days. The nobility, the merchants, the clergy, they all have stores of food that the common people don't. They have private wells, private guards, private escape plans that they're not sharing with anyone. Class distinctions that were always present but manageable in peacetime become life and death differences in a siege. The rich eat meat while the poor eat grass. The powerful have clean water while everyone else drinks from increasingly contaminated sources. And when people start dying, it's not the lords and ladies who die first. Food rationing begins, but it's not the fair, organized system you might imagine. It's not like everyone gets an equal share, and you all starve together like a community. The people with power take what they need first. The people with gold buy what's left at increasingly insane prices. And everyone else fights over scraps. Sometimes literally. A single loaf of bread can cost more than a month's wages. A piece of meat becomes worth killing for. And when the official food runs out, that's when things get really medieval. You start eating things that aren't food. Leather becomes soup. Bark becomes bread. Grass becomes a luxury. During the siege of Jerusalem in 1099, people were eating the leather from their own shoes and count themselves lucky to have it. Tree bark was ground into flour, mixed with sawdust, and baked into loaves that could barely be called bread. And when there are no more trees inside the walls, when every piece of leather has been consumed, when every blade of grass has been stripped and eaten. That's when you start looking at things you never thought you'd look at. Pet animals disappear first. Dogs, cats, even rats become delicacies. Then horses, if there are any left. During the siege of Paris by the Vikings in 885, even the rats became so scarce that people fought over them. A single cat could feed a family for 3 days, assuming you could catch it and assuming you could stomach what you were doing. And when the animals are gone, when every living thing inside the walls has been hunted down and consumed, that's when you realize the siege is just getting started. Because the thing about medieval sieges is that they're not about quick victories, they're about patience. The army outside doesn't want to lose soldiers climbing your walls or breaking down your gates. They want you to do the work for them. They want you to weaken yourselves, to turn on each other, to open the gates yourselves just to make the suffering stop. And they're willing to wait months, even years, for that to happen. The siege of Troy allegedly lasted 10 years. The siege of Constantinople in 717-718 lasted almost a year. The siege of Orleans went on for 7 months. These weren't quick, decisive battles. They were slow-motion apocalypses, where entire populations were ground down day by day until surrender became not just an option, but a relief. And here's the truly horrifying part. The longer the siege goes on, the worse your situation becomes, even if you're winning. Even if your walls hold, even if you repel every assault, even if you maintain your defenses perfectly, you're still losing. Because every day that passes, you have less food, less water, less hope, and more people who are sick, dying, or already dead. Victory in a siege isn't about being stronger than the enemy. It's about being able to outlast your own city's collapse. The army outside your walls isn't just soldiers. It's a mobile city designed to outlast your stationary one. They have supply lines stretching back to friendly territory. They have fresh food arriving regularly. They have reinforcements coming in to replace anyone who gets sick or injured. They have the luxury of time, while you have the burden of it. And they have siege engines. Oh, do they have siege engines? The first thing you notice about siege engines isn't their size, though they are massive. It's the sound they make. Each type of siege weapon has its own terrifying signature. The trebuchet makes a deep groaning sound as its counterweight drops, followed by a whoosh as the arm swings up, followed by a whistle as the projectile arcs through the air, followed by a crash that shakes your bones when it hits the wall. You learn to recognize that sequence, to count the seconds between the groan and the crash, to calculate whether you have time to run or if you should just close your eyes and hope the stone lands somewhere else. The catapult has a different rhythm. A sharp crack as the tension is released, a snap as the arm hits its stop, and then that same whistling sound as death comes flying over the walls. But catapults are less predictable than trebuchets. Their projectiles come in at lower angles, hit different parts of the wall, sometimes sail right over and crash into the city itself. Ballistae sound like giant crossbows, because that's essentially what they are. A twang as the cord is released, and then a bolt the size of a spear comes flying at the walls fast enough to punch through stone. They're not trying to knock down the walls with ballistae, they're trying to kill anyone standing on them. And then there are the battering rams. You can hear them coming from inside the city. The rhythmic boom, 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 as hundreds of men swing a massive log against your gates. Each impact shakes the ground. Each impact makes you wonder if this is the blow that finally breaks through. The gates are thick, reinforced with iron, built to last centuries. But they weren't built to withstand months of constant pounding from a ram that weighs more than a house. But here's what the movies don't tell you about siege engines. They're not just trying to break your walls, they're trying to break your spirit. Every stone that crashes against the fortifications is a reminder that the enemy has unlimited ammunition and unlimited time. Every bolt that punches through a defender's chest is a message to everyone else on the walls. Every blow from the battering ram is counting down to the moment when your last line of defense fails. And they don't just throw stones. Medieval siege engineers were creative in their cruelty. They hurled diseased animal carcasses over the walls to spread plague. They launched pots of burning oil to start fires inside the city. They shot severed heads from catapults, sometimes the heads of captured messengers, sometimes the heads of anyone who had tried to escape. During the siege of Kaffa in 1346, the attacking Mongols catapulted plague-infected corpses over the walls, possibly spreading the Black Death into Europe. They also used psychological projectiles, messages tied to stones, describing in graphic detail what would happen to everyone inside the city when the walls finally fell. Drawings of torture devices. Lists of cities that had already surrendered and been spared versus cities that had resisted and been destroyed. The siege engines weren't just weapons of war, they were weapons of terror. But the most effective projectile was often the simplest. Just stones. Big, heavy stones that could punch holes in walls, crush buildings, and kill anyone unlucky enough to be standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. A single trebuchet could throw a 300-pound stone over 300 yards with enough force to shatter a wall that had stood for centuries, and they had dozens of trebuchets, working in shifts, hurling stones day and night. The walls that had seemed so solid, so permanent, so protective, start to show damage within weeks. First just chips and cracks where the stones hit, then larger holes where repeated impacts have weakened the masonry, then gaps that defenders have to fill with whatever they can find. Furniture, rubble, bodies, and eventually breaches wide enough for the enemy to pour through. But even before the walls fall, the siege engines change life inside the city. You can't stand near the walls anymore, because that's where the projectiles land. You can't sleep in tall buildings because they're targets. You can't gather in large groups, because that's what the enemy is aiming for. The siege engines don't just attack your defenses, they attack your ability to live normally, to move freely, to feel safe anywhere inside your own city. And just when you think you understand the pattern, when you think you can predict where the next stone will land or when the next assault will come, they change tactics. They move their engines to different positions. They start firing at night. They alternate between different types of projectiles to keep you guessing. They want you to know that they can kill you anytime they want, from anywhere they want, and there's nothing you can do to stop them. The siege engines are just the beginning. They're the announcement that your world is about to end. The real killing hasn't even started yet. By the second week of the siege, you start to understand that food is going to be a problem. Not just expensive, not just scarce, but a legitimate, life or death problem. The city's emergency stores were never meant to feed everyone indefinitely. They were meant to last through a bad harvest or a brief blockade. This isn't brief. The first sign is the bread. Yesterday it was normal bread, maybe a little coarser than usual, maybe a little darker, but still recognizably bread. Today, it's different, grittier, more filling, but also more difficult to chew. You ask the baker what's changed, and he mumbles something about stretching the flour, making it last longer. What he doesn't tell you is that half of what you're eating is sawdust now. Sawdust bread isn't as crazy as it sounds. Wood pulp has some nutritional value, and it fills your stomach, even if it doesn't really nourish your body. During the siege of Paris in 1590, bakers were ordered to mix wood shavings into the flour to make it last longer. People complained that the bread was hard to digest, that it caused stomach problems, that it didn't satisfy their hunger the way real bread did. But it was still bread, technically, and it was better than no bread at all. The meat disappears next. First the good cuts, then the cheap cuts, then anything that could reasonably be called meat. The butcher shops that usually display hanging carcasses and fresh cuts are now empty, their owners standing behind counters with nothing to sell. When someone does manage to find meat, the price is astronomical. A small piece of beef costs what a whole cow cost before the siege. And you start to suspect that what they're calling beef might not actually be beef. Horses start disappearing from the stables. Officially, they're being used by the defenders for military purposes. Unofficially, they're being butchered and sold as exotic meat to anyone with enough gold to afford it. Horse meat is tough, stringy, and has a strange sweet taste that never quite sits right in your stomach. But it's protein, and protein is becoming more valuable than gold. Then the pets start vanishing. Dogs first, because they're larger and provide more meat. Cats follow, even though cat meat is notoriously tough and unpleasant. During the siege of Jerusalem in 1099, chroniclers recorded that dogs and cats became so valuable as food that people fought over them in the streets. A single dog could feed a family for days, assuming the family could stomach what they were eating. You find yourself looking at your neighbor's animals differently. That pig that used to seem like a normal part of the household now looks like a week's worth of meals. That chicken that used to provide eggs now looks like one good dinner. You start to understand why people are being so secretive about their livestock, why barns are being guarded, why simple animals have become precious beyond measure. But even the animals don't last long. A city under siege is a closed system, and there are only so many living creatures inside the walls. The math is simple and brutal. Every day, people need to eat something, and every day, there are fewer things left to eat. It's not a question of if the food will run out. It's a question of when, and what you'll do after that happens. Rats become a delicacy. This isn't a joke or an exaggeration. Rats are clean, relatively speaking. They're quick to catch if you know what you're doing. They provide actual meat, and they reproduce quickly enough that there's always a steady supply. Rat catchers, who were considered low-class workers before the siege, suddenly become some of the most valuable people in the city. The process of preparing rat for eating is more involved than you might think. First, you have to catch them, which requires skill, patience, and usually some kind of trap. Then you have to skin them, which is easier than skinning larger animals, but still requires a sharp knife and a strong stomach. Then you have to remove the organs, some of which are edible, and some of which definitely are not. And then you have to cook them long enough to kill any diseases they might be carrying, but not so long that the meat becomes too tough to chew. Rat stew becomes a common meal. You take whatever vegetables you can find, usually grass or weeds from areas that haven't been completely stripped bare. Add some water, and boil it all together with pieces of rat meat. It's not appetizing, but it provides calories and some nutrients, and it fills your stomach enough that the hunger pains subside for a few hours. But even rats don't last forever. They're smart enough to avoid traps after a while, and they're also being hunted by desperate people all over the city. The rats that survive are the clever ones, the ones that are hardest to catch. And as the human population gets more desperate and more skilled at hunting, the rat population declines rapidly. Then you start eating things that aren't really food at all. Leather becomes soup stock. You take old shoes, old belts, any piece of leather you can find, and you boil it for hours until it becomes soft enough to chew. It doesn't taste like much, but it provides some calories, and it takes a long time to eat, which tricks your stomach into thinking it's being fed. Tree bark becomes flour substitute. You strip bark from any trees inside the city walls, dry it, grind it up as fine as you can manage, and mix it with whatever actual flour is left to make something that resembles bread. Bark bread is tough, bitter, and difficult to digest, but it's filling, and it doesn't require any ingredients that people are fighting over. Grass becomes salad. You gather any edible plants you can find inside the city. Grass, weeds, leaves from trees. Anything green that isn't obviously poisonous. You eat it raw if you have to, or boil it into a thin soup if you have fuel for a fire. It provides almost no nutrition, but it gives your jaw something to do and your stomach something to process. Bones become soup base. After every animal in the city has been butchered and eaten, the bones remain. You can boil bones for days to extract any remaining marrow and nutrients. Bone soup is mostly water, but it has a faint taste of whatever animal the bones came from, and it's warm, which becomes important when fuel for fires becomes scarce. And when all of that is gone, when every piece of leather has been eaten, when every tree inside the walls has been stripped bare, when every bone has been boiled into nothing, that's when people start looking at each other differently. Cannibalism in medieval sieges wasn't common, but it wasn't unheard of either. During the siege of Ma'ara in 1098, Crusader chroniclers recorded instances of people eating human flesh out of desperation. During the siege of Sancerre in 1573, there were reports of people consuming the bodies of those who had died from starvation. It's the line that most people thought they would never cross, right up until they cross it. The first instances are usually explained away. Someone dies from disease or injury, and their body is processed for meat before it can rot. It's presented as being practical, even respectful. We can't bury them properly anyway, people say. We can't waste anything, they argue. The dead person would want us to survive, they convince themselves. But once that line is crossed, it becomes easier to cross again and again. And the definition of already dead starts to expand. People who are dying become people who might die, become people who probably won't survive anyway. The social contracts that hold society together start breaking down when survival becomes the only moral imperative. Not everyone participates. Many people choose to starve rather than eat human flesh. Many others find ways to avoid it by being more successful at finding alternative food sources. But enough people participate that it becomes an open secret, something that everyone knows is happening even if no one talks about it directly. And here's the thing that would shock you most about starvation in a medieval siege. It's not quick. It's not like you miss a few meals and then collapse. Starvation is a slow process that takes weeks or months, and it changes you gradually. First, you just feel hungry all the time. Then you start losing weight. Then you start losing muscle mass. Then your body starts consuming its own organs to stay alive. You become obsessed with food in ways that consume your entire mental capacity. You dream about food. You think about food every waking moment. You remember meals you had years ago in perfect detail. You plan elaborate fantasy feasts in your head. Food becomes not just a physical need, but a psychological fixation that crowds out every other thought. Your personality changes. You become irritable, aggressive, paranoid. You start hoarding anything that might be edible, even things that probably aren't safe to eat. You become suspicious of your neighbors, your friends, even your family members. Anyone who has food becomes a potential enemy. Anyone who looks better fed than you becomes a target of resentment. You start making deals with yourself. Just one more day without eating, and then you'll try to find something. Just one more week, and then you'll consider options you previously thought were unthinkable. Just one more month, and then maybe the siege will be over, and none of this will matter. But the siege isn't over. The siege is just getting started, and food was just the first problem. But while you're slowly starving, something even worse is brewing inside the city walls. Something that will kill more people than the siege engines, more people than starvation, more people than enemy soldiers. Disease. And in a medieval siege, disease doesn't just spread, it explodes. Think about the conditions inside your besieged city. Thousands of people crammed into a space that was never meant to hold this many bodies for this long. The surrounding countryside, where people usually went to relieve themselves or dispose of waste, is now controlled by the enemy. The normal systems for removing garbage, human waste, and dead bodies have completely broken down, and everyone is weakened by hunger, stress, and fear, making their immune systems about as effective as wet parchment against a sword. The first sign isn't dramatic. It's just that people start getting sick more often than usual. A cough here, a fever there, some stomach problems that seem to be going around. At first, you assume it's just the stress of the siege, or maybe people are eating things they shouldn't be eating. Because by now, everyone is definitely eating things they shouldn't be eating. But then the sickness starts spreading faster than rumors. One person in your neighborhood has a fever on Monday. By Wednesday, half the street is coughing. By Friday, people are dying. And by the following week, you realize that whatever this is, it's not just bad luck or bad food. It's a plague, and it's turning your city into a death trap. Medieval understanding of disease was, to put it charitably, limited. They knew that sick people could make healthy people sick, but they didn't understand how or why. They thought disease was caused by bad air, or divine punishment, or an imbalance of bodily humours, or the alignment of planets. They had no concept of bacteria, or viruses, or parasites. They just knew that when people got sick in large groups, a lot of them died, and there wasn't much anyone could do about it. The most common killer in medieval sieges was dysentery. This is a disease that attacks your digestive system and essentially kills you by making you shit yourself to death. I'm not being crude for shock value. That's literally what dysentery does. It causes severe diarrhea, dehydration, and death, usually within a few days of the symptoms starting. Dysentery spreads through contaminated water and food, which in a besieged city is basically all the water and food. The wells become contaminated with human waste because there's nowhere else to put the waste and no way to properly maintain sanitation. The remaining food becomes contaminated because people are preparing it with dirty hands and dirty water. And once dysentery starts spreading, it's almost impossible to stop. The symptoms are horrific. It starts with stomach cramps and loose bowel movements. Then the diarrhea becomes more frequent and more liquid. Then you start seeing blood and mucus in your stool. Then you become so dehydrated that you can't think clearly, can't keep any food or water down, and can't control your bodily functions at all. You spend your days running to whatever passes for a toilet, which in a besieged city is usually just a corner, somewhere that's been designated for human waste. But the toilets are overflowing, because everyone else is sick too, and there's no one healthy enough to maintain them. So you end up relieving yourself wherever you can, which contaminates more areas, which spreads the disease to more people. The dehydration is what actually kills you. Your body loses so much water through diarrhea that your organs start shutting down. Your blood becomes thick and sluggish. Your brain stops functioning properly. You become delirious, unable to recognize friends and family, unable to make rational decisions about your own care. And here's the medieval nightmare part. There's no treatment, no antibiotics, no IV fluids, no oral rehydration therapy. The best medical advice is to rest. Drink clean water, if you can find any, and pray. But clean water is exactly what you don't have. Rest is impossible when you're constantly running to the latrine, and prayer doesn't seem to be working for anyone. Typhus is another common siege killer, spread by lice and fleas. And guess what thrives in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions where people can't bathe regularly and are wearing the same clothes for months? Lice and fleas. They jump from person to person, carrying typhus bacteria with them, turning every social interaction into a potential death sentence. Typhus starts with a high fever, severe headaches, and a rash that spreads across your body. Then you develop delirium, which means you start seeing things that aren't there and saying things that don't make sense. Then your organs start failing, and then you die. The whole process takes about 2 weeks, during which you're completely helpless and need constant care from people who are probably also sick. But the worst part about typhus is that it's highly contagious, and you're most contagious before you know you're sick. So you spend several days walking around the city, talking to people, sharing food and water, and spreading the disease to everyone you encounter. By the time you realize you're dying, you've already infected dozens of other people. Plague is the siege disease that everyone fears most, and for good reason. Bubonic plague, spread by fleas that live on rats, can kill 60% of the people who contract it. And as we've established, besieged cities are full of rats. The rats are eating the garbage and human waste that's piling up everywhere. The fleas are living on the rats, and when the rats die, the fleas jump to human hosts. Plague symptoms start with fever, chills, and weakness. Then you develop buboes, which are swollen, painful lymph nodes that can grow to the size of eggs. The buboes usually appear in your groin, armpits, or neck, and they're so painful that you can't move without agony. Then you start coughing up blood. Your skin turns black in patches, and you die in screaming agony. But plague also comes in a pneumonic form that spreads through the air when infected people cough or sneeze. Pneumonic plague is even deadlier than bubonic plague, killing almost everyone who contracts it within days. And it spreads so quickly that entire neighborhoods can be wiped out before anyone realizes what's happening. The thing about plague is that it doesn't just kill individuals, it kills communities. It spreads so fast and kills so efficiently that it can depopulate entire sections of a besieged city within weeks. Families disappear, professions disappear, knowledge and skills disappear when the people who possessed them die. Smallpox was another medieval nightmare, especially deadly to populations that hadn't been exposed to it before. It starts with fever and aches, then develops into a rash that turns into pus-filled blisters covering your entire body. The blisters are incredibly painful, and when they finally scab over and fall off, they leave permanent scars. If you survive, which many people don't. But here's what makes disease particularly horrific in a siege context. You can't escape it, you can't treat it effectively, and you can't avoid the conditions that spread it. In normal times, when people got sick, they could be isolated, cared for properly, or moved to cleaner environments. In a siege, everyone is trapped together in increasingly unsanitary conditions, with no way out and no access to medical care. The city's physicians, if there are any, are overwhelmed within weeks. They don't understand what causes the diseases, they don't have effective treatments, and they're just as likely to get sick as anyone else. Many of them die early in the siege, leaving the remaining population with no medical knowledge at all. So people resort to folk remedies, superstitions, and desperate measures. They burn herbs to purify the air, not knowing that the disease isn't airborne. They bleed sick people to balance their humours, not knowing that they're making them weaker. They pray to saints and perform rituals, not knowing that the diseases are caused by bacteria and parasites that don't care about religious devotion. And the diseases don't just kill, they incapacitate. For every person who dies, there are several more who are too sick to work, too sick to fight, too sick to maintain the city's defences. The walls still need to be guarded, but half the guards are shitting themselves to death. The siege engines still need to be repaired when the enemy damages them, but the craftsmen are delirious with fever. The food still needs to be distributed, but the people responsible for distribution can't get out of bed. The city's ability to defend itself deteriorates not just because people are dying, but because the people who are still alive are too sick to function effectively. Decision-making becomes impossible when the city's leaders are hallucinating from typhus. Military strategy becomes meaningless when the soldiers are too weak from dysentery to hold their weapons. And here's the feedback loop that makes siege diseases so deadly. The sicker people get, the worse the sanitary conditions become, which makes more people sick, which makes the conditions even worse. Dead bodies pile up faster than they can be buried. Human waste accumulates in every corner of the city. Garbage rots in the streets because there's no one healthy enough to remove it. The smell becomes unbearable, not just unpleasant, but physically nauseating. The stench of human waste, rotting food, and decomposing bodies creates a miasma that hangs over the entire city like a visible cloud of death. People cover their faces with cloth, but it doesn't help much. The smell gets into your clothes, your hair, your skin. It becomes impossible to escape, and the enemy outside knows exactly what's happening. They can smell the city dying. They can see the smoke from the funeral pyres, when there's still enough fuel for funeral pyres. They can hear the sounds of sickness, people coughing, vomiting, crying in pain. They know that time is on their side, that the city is destroying itself from within. Sometimes the attackers help the process along. They catapult diseased animal carcasses over the walls to introduce new diseases or make existing ones worse. They poison any water sources they can reach. They prevent anyone from leaving the city, even people who are obviously sick and pose no military threat. They want the diseases to spread. They want the city to become a festering wound that's too weak to resist when they finally decide to attack. The social fabric of the city starts to unravel as disease spreads. Families abandon sick members because they can't afford to care for them, and they're afraid of getting infected themselves. Neighbors stop helping neighbors. Communities that were once close-knit become collections of isolated individuals trying to survive on their own. Traditional gender roles break down when everyone is either sick or caring for someone who's sick. Children are forced to care for adult family members. Elderly people are left to die alone because the younger generation is too busy trying not to die themselves. Marriages dissolve when one spouse becomes a burden the other can't afford to carry. Religious faith, which was supposed to provide comfort during times of crisis, starts to crumble. People pray for healing that never comes. They perform pilgrimages to shrines inside the city walls, but the shrines don't provide miracles. They confess their sins and receive last rites, but they die anyway. The clergy, who are supposed to have a special connection to God, die at the same rate as everyone else. Some people become fatalistic, deciding that death is inevitable and there's no point in trying to avoid it. They stop taking precautions, stop trying to stay clean, stop caring about their own survival. Others become obsessively protective, avoiding all human contact, hoarding medical supplies that don't work, and becoming paranoid about every cough or sneeze. And through it all, the siege continues. The enemy doesn't pause their attacks because people inside the city are sick. If anything, they increase the pressure, knowing that the defenders are weakened. The siege engines keep firing. The walls keep taking damage. The psychological warfare continues. But disease doesn't just weaken the city's ability to resist. It changes the entire nature of the siege. What started as a military conflict becomes a humanitarian disaster. What began as a struggle between armies becomes a fight against death itself. And death, in a medieval siege, usually wins. The winter months are particularly brutal. Disease spreads faster in cold weather, when people are crowded together, indoors. Food becomes even scarcer when what little farming might have been possible inside the walls stops completely. Fuel for fires becomes precious, so people freeze as well as starve and sicken. Respiratory diseases like pneumonia become common killers during winter sieges. People's lungs are already weakened by malnutrition and stress. They're living in damp, cold conditions without adequate clothing or heating, and they're breathing air that's contaminated with smoke from fires, dust from crumbling buildings, and the exhalations of thousands of other people. Pneumonia starts with a cough and fever, but it quickly progresses to difficulty breathing, chest pain, and the production of bloody sputum. Without antibiotics, it's often fatal, especially in people who are already weakened by other conditions. And it spreads easily through coughing and sneezing, making it another disease that feeds on the crowded conditions of a siege. Frostbite and hypothermia become problems when people can't maintain adequate fires or don't have warm clothing. Fingers and toes turn black and fall off. People freeze to death in their sleep, and the cold makes every other condition worse. Malnutrition is more deadly when your body is trying to generate heat. Diseases progress faster when your immune system is suppressed by cold stress. The psychological impact of watching everyone around you get sick and die is devastating. You start to expect that every person you care about will eventually develop symptoms. You become afraid to form new relationships because you know they'll probably end in death. You start to view other people primarily as potential sources of infection. Sleep becomes almost impossible, not just because of the physical discomfort, but because of the mental stress. You lie awake, listening to people coughing, retching, crying, in pain. You wonder if the person sleeping next to you is developing a fever. You check your own body obsessively for early symptoms of disease. And here's something that would shock modern people. In a medieval siege, getting sick isn't just a health problem, it's an economic problem. If you're too sick to work, you can't earn money to buy food. If you're caring for sick family members, you can't work either. If you spend your savings on medicine that doesn't work, you have nothing left for food. The few doctors and healers in the city start charging outrageous prices for their services, knowing that desperate people will pay anything for hope. Fake remedies proliferate. Charlatans and con artists take advantage of people's desperation. The market for medical care becomes predatory, with the people who need help most being the least able to afford it. Some families are forced to choose which members to try to save and which to let die. They don't have enough resources to care for everyone, so they have to make horrible decisions about who gets the limited food, medicine, and attention available. These decisions tear families apart and create guilt that lasts long after the siege ends, assuming anyone survives to feel guilty. Children suffer particularly badly in siege disease outbreaks. Their immune systems are less developed, so they're more susceptible to infection. They're less able to communicate their symptoms clearly. They require more care and attention when they're sick. But that care often isn't available, and they don't understand what's happening to them, or why the adults around them can't make them feel better. Infant mortality rates skyrocket during sieges. Babies die from diseases that their mothers can't identify or treat. They die from malnutrition when their mothers can't produce enough breast milk. They die from exposure when there isn't adequate shelter or clothing. They die from neglect when their parents are too sick or overwhelmed to care for them properly. Pregnant women face additional horrors. Malnutrition and stress cause miscarriages and stillbirths. Diseases that might not be fatal to healthy adults can kill pregnant women and their unborn children. And if a woman does manage to carry a pregnancy to term during a siege, she's giving birth in conditions that are almost guaranteed to cause infection and death. The midwives and birth attendants who would normally help with deliveries are often dead or too sick to provide assistance. So women give birth alone, or with help from family members who have no medical training. Many women die in childbirth from complications that could have been prevented with proper care. Many babies die within days of birth from infections they contract during delivery. And even if both mother and child survive the birth, they face the same starvation, disease, and violence that everyone else in the city faces. The mother is weakened from childbirth and needs extra nutrition to recover and produce milk, but there is no extra nutrition available. The baby needs clean water and safe food as they grow, but there is no clean water or safe food. The elderly die first and fastest during siege disease outbreaks. Their immune systems are already compromised by age. They often have pre-existing health conditions that make them more vulnerable to new infections. And in a society where resources are scarce, they're often the first to be abandoned when families have to make difficult choices about who to care for. But the deaths of elderly people represent more than just individual tragedies. These are the people who possess the most knowledge about survival, about medicine, about crafts and skills that might be useful during the siege. When they die, their knowledge dies with them. The city becomes progressively less capable of caring for itself as the people with the most experience and wisdom are lost. Mental illness becomes rampant during long sieges. The constant stress, the witnessing of death and suffering, the fear of infection, the uncertainty about the future, all combine to create psychological conditions that medieval people had no way to understand or treat. People develop what we would now recognize as depression, anxiety disorders, and post-traumatic stress. Some people become catatonic, withdrawing completely from reality and sitting motionless for hours or days. Others become manic, talking rapidly, making grandiose plans, and engaging in reckless behavior. Still others become violent, lashing out at family members or neighbors over minor disagreements. Suicide becomes more common, though it's rarely discussed openly because of religious prohibitions. People jump from walls, hang themselves, or simply stop eating and drinking until they die. Some participate in increasingly dangerous activities, essentially committing suicide by taking unnecessary risks. The combination of malnutrition, disease, stress, and mental illness creates a population that's not capable of making rational decisions about their own survival. People make choices that seem obviously self-destructive to outside observers, but that make sense within the context of their deteriorated mental and physical state. And all of this happens while the siege itself continues. The enemy outside doesn't stop attacking because people inside are sick. If anything, they increase their efforts when they realize how weakened the city has become. Disease doesn't pause the war. It becomes another weapon in the war. The attackers can hear the city dying. They can smell it. They can see the smoke from the funeral pyres and the reduced activity on the walls. They know that every day they wait, the city becomes weaker and more willing to surrender. Time is completely on their side. But even disease and starvation aren't the worst parts of a medieval siege. The worst part is watching your city turn into something that isn't a city anymore. It's watching the social structures that held your community together collapse one by one, until what's left isn't a society, it's just a collection of desperate individuals trying to survive at any cost. The breakdown starts with small things. People stop following rules that no longer make sense. Why worry about noise ordinances when siege engines are firing all night? Why respect property boundaries when the owner died last week from dysentery? Why maintain social courtesies when everyone might be dead tomorrow? But quickly, the breakdown becomes more serious. People start stealing food from their neighbors. Families abandon sick members to avoid infection. Parents leave children who have become too much of a burden. Communities that once helped each other become collections of competing factions fighting over increasingly scarce resources. The city's government, such as it is, becomes unable to maintain order. The officials are either dead, sick, or too overwhelmed by the crisis to perform their duties. Laws become unenforceable because there's no one healthy enough to enforce them. Courts stop functioning because there are no judges, no guards, no officials to run them. Crime rates explode, but in ways that medieval people weren't prepared for. It's not just theft and violence, though there's plenty of that. It's also fraud, as people sell fake medicines and food to desperate buyers. It's kidnapping, as people try to force others to work for them or give up their resources. It's extortion, as those with any remaining power use it to extract wealth from those who have none. But the most shocking thing about the social breakdown in a medieval siege is how quickly it happens and how completely it transforms people. Individuals who were kind, generous, and community-minded before the siege become selfish, cruel, and predatory within weeks. The stress and desperation bring out the worst in human nature, and there are no social institutions strong enough to contain it. Religious institutions, which were supposed to provide moral guidance and community support, often become part of the problem rather than part of the solution. Churches hoard food and supplies for the clergy, while parishioners starve. Religious leaders preach about divine punishment and the need for suffering while living in relative comfort. The moral authority that religion once provided disappears when its representatives are seen as hypocritical and self-serving. Economic systems collapse completely. Money becomes worthless because there's nothing to buy with it. Trade stops because there are no goods to trade. Skills and professions become irrelevant because the only skill that matters is staying alive. The entire economic structure that supported the city before the siege simply ceases to exist. Social hierarchies invert in unpredictable ways. People who were powerful before the siege find themselves helpless if their power was based on things that no longer matter. People who were poor before the siege sometimes find themselves in positions of influence if they have skills or resources that are useful for survival. But these new hierarchies are unstable and constantly changing as circumstances change. Marriage and family relationships become transactional. People form partnerships based on survival needs rather than affection. They abandon family members who have become liabilities. They use their children as tools for earning food or gaining protection. Love becomes a luxury that few people can afford. And through all of this social collapse, the siege continues. The enemy outside is patient. They know that time is working in their favor. Every day the city remains under siege. It becomes less capable of resistance and more willing to accept whatever terms the attackers offer. The siege isn't just a military tactic. It's a form of psychological warfare designed to break the spirit of the defenders before breaking their walls. The attackers send messages over the walls, describing the terrible fate that awaits anyone who continues to resist. They parade captured defenders in front of the city, torturing them where everyone inside can see and hear. They display the heads of messengers who tried to escape. They want everyone inside to know that resistance is futile and surrender is the only option. But even surrender might not save you. Medieval armies weren't known for their mercy towards cities that had resisted for a long time. The longer the siege dragged on, the more angry and frustrated the attackers became. By the time the city finally fell, the army outside might be in a mood for revenge rather than clemency. And that's when you realize the true horror of a medieval siege. You're not just fighting for your life. You're fighting for the right to die on your own terms. Because whether the city falls to assault, surrenders, or is abandoned, the outcome for most of the people inside is the same. Death, either quick and violent or slow and agonizing. But death nonetheless. The siege has become a machine for killing entire populations, and you're trapped inside it with no way out. The walls that were supposed to protect you have become the walls of your tomb, and the only question left is whether you'll die from starvation, disease, violence, or despair. But the siege still isn't over. The worst is yet to come. After months of starvation, disease, and social collapse, you might think the worst part of the siege is behind you. You might think that since you've survived this long, you've proven your resilience and earned your right to see the end of this nightmare. You would be catastrophically wrong, because everything that's happened so far has just been the softening up phase. The real horror begins when the enemy decides they're tired of waiting and launches the final assault. The signs start days before the actual attack. The siege engines that have been firing sporadically start firing constantly, not just during the day, but all night long. The rhythm changes from the methodical, patient bombardment you've grown accustomed to something frantic and overwhelming. Stones crash against the walls every few minutes, creating a thunderous cacophony that makes sleep impossible and conversation difficult. But it's not just the frequency that changes, it's the targeting. Instead of aiming at random sections of the wall, the siege engines start concentrating their fire on specific weak points. You can see the strategy developing as holes in the wall grow larger and more focused. The enemy has been studying your defenses for months, identifying exactly where to strike for maximum effect. New siege engines appear overnight, as if they've been hiding just beyond the horizon waiting for this moment. Massive trebuchets that dwarf the ones you've been watching for months. Catapults with multiple arms that can fire several projectiles simultaneously. Ballistae so large they require crews of dozens of men just to operate. The enemy has been saving their best weapons for the final push. The projectiles change too. Instead of just stones and the occasional flaming pot, they start firing more exotic ammunition. Barrels of burning pitch that explode on impact, spreading fire across wide areas. Bundles of arrows that scatter in mid-air, creating deadly rain over the defenders. Pots filled with quicklime that burst and blind anyone nearby. And increasingly, they fire nothing at all, just letting the siege engines create noise and fear without wasting ammunition. You realize that the psychological impact is intentional. They want you to know that the final assault is coming, but they don't want you to know when. They want you to spend days or weeks in anticipation, jumping at every sound, wondering if this is the moment your defenses finally fail. They want you exhausted and terrified before the actual fighting even begins. The bombardment becomes so intense that parts of the city away from the walls start taking damage. Buildings collapse from stray projectiles. Fires start and spread because there aren't enough healthy people to fight them effectively. The city that has been slowly dying for months starts physically crumbling around you. And then, just when the bombardment reaches its peak intensity, it stops. Complete silence. After months of constant noise from siege engines, the sudden quiet is more terrifying than the loudest crash. You strain your ears, listening for any sound that might give you a clue about what's happening outside the walls. But there's nothing. Just an ominous, pregnant silence that feels like the world holding its breath. This is when you learn that the siege engines were never really meant to knock down your walls. They were meant to weaken them, to create cracks and gaps and unstable sections. But the real work of bringing down the walls happens underground, in tunnels that have been dug in secret for weeks or months. Medieval siege engineers were masters of undermining, the art of digging tunnels under enemy fortifications and then collapsing them. While you were watching the dramatic siege engines above ground, teams of miners were working in shifts underground, slowly digging their way beneath your walls. They started far from the city, where their work couldn't be detected, and gradually worked their way closer. The tunnels aren't crude holes in the ground. They're carefully engineered passages, reinforced with wooden supports, and designed to reach precisely the right points under the walls. The miners work in dangerous conditions, always at risk of cave-ins, flooding, or discovery by counter-miners from the city. But they're experts at their job, and they've been doing this work for months while you were focused on more obvious threats. When the tunnel reaches the foundation of the wall, the miners don't immediately bring it down. Instead, they create a large chamber and fill it with combustible materials. Wood, straw, animal fat, anything that will burn hot and fast. Then they add wooden supports to hold up the weight of the wall above. The tunnel becomes a carefully constructed trap, waiting for the right moment to spring. The moment comes when the siege engines stop firing. In the sudden silence, you might hear a faint rumbling from underground, like distant thunder or a very quiet earthquake. Then you hear shouts from the guards on the walls, frantic voices trying to identify the source of the sound. And then, with a crash that shakes the entire city, a section of the wall simply disappears. Not crumbles or falls down, disappears. One moment there's a solid stone barrier between you and the enemy army. The next moment there's a gap, 50 feet wide, filled with rubble and dust. The wooden supports in the tunnel have been set on fire, burned away in minutes, and allowed the weight of the wall to collapse the undermined section. Through the gap, you can see the enemy army forming up for assault. Not just a few soldiers, but thousands of them, arranged in precise formations and ready to pour through the breach. They've been waiting for this moment, just as long as you've been dreading it. And now that the moment has arrived, they're ready to end the siege in the most violent way possible. But even before the enemy soldiers reach the breach, you face a more immediate problem: panic. The people inside the city, weakened by months of siege conditions, react to the breach with complete terror. Families abandon their homes and run toward the center of the city, carrying whatever possessions they can grab. Soldiers desert their posts to protect their own families. The organized defense that might have been possible collapses into chaos within minutes. The streets become clogged with refugees trying to escape from areas near the walls. But there's nowhere to escape to. The city is surrounded, and the enemy controls all the exits. The people fleeing from the breach are just crowding into areas that will be reached by the attacking army within hours. They're not escaping. They're just making themselves easier targets. Some people try to hide in cellars, attics, or other concealed spaces, hoping to wait out the assault and emerge when the fighting is over. This strategy might work in a normal battle, but medieval armies that have spent months besieging a city aren't interested in quick victories. They're interested in thorough conquests. They know that hidden defenders can cause problems later, so they systematically search every building, every room, every possible hiding place. Others try to disguise themselves as civilians, assuming that the attacking army will spare non-combatants. This assumption is tragically naive. Medieval armies that had spent months being frustrated by siege conditions weren't known for their careful discrimination between combatants and civilians. Everyone inside the city walls was considered an enemy, and everyone was a legitimate target for violence. The lucky ones are killed quickly in the initial assault. Soldiers pour through the breach in the wall and spread throughout the city, killing anyone they encounter without much regard for age, gender, or apparent threat level. If you're near the breach when it happens, you might die from an arrow or sword thrust before you even understand what's happening. This is actually the best possible outcome, but most people don't die quickly. Medieval armies had learned that rapid killing was less effective than controlled terrorization for breaking the resistance of a city. They wanted some people to survive the initial assault so that word would spread about what happened to cities that resisted siege. They wanted survivors to tell other cities about the consequences of defying their army. So the killing is often deliberately slow and public. People are tortured before being executed, not for information but for the psychological impact on witnesses. Families are forced to watch as their members are killed one by one. Children are killed in front of their parents, parents in front of their children, spouses in front of each other. The goal is to break the spirit of anyone who might consider resistance in the future. Sexual violence becomes systematic. Women and girls are assaulted not as random acts of individual soldiers, but as organized policy designed to humiliate the conquered population and demonstrate the completeness of their defeat. The attacks happen in public, often in front of family members, to maximize the psychological damage. Age doesn't provide protection. Soldiers assault women from childhood to old age. But sexual violence in medieval warfare wasn't limited to women. Men and boys were also targets, both as victims and as forced witnesses to attacks on their family members. The goal was to emasculate the male population, to demonstrate that they had failed in their basic duty to protect their families and communities. The economic motives of the attacking army add another layer of horror to the assault. These soldiers haven't been paid in months. They've been promised that they can keep whatever they can loot from the city. Every building becomes a potential treasure trove, and every person becomes either a source of valuables or an obstacle to finding valuables. Torture is used to extract information about hidden wealth. Even people who have no wealth are tortured because the soldiers assume everyone is hiding something valuable. The torture techniques are creative and prolonged, designed to cause maximum pain while keeping the victim conscious and able to provide information. Children are sometimes spared immediate death, but not out of mercy. They're valuable as slaves, and healthy children can be sold in markets hundreds of miles away. But the journey to those markets is brutal, and many children die along the way from exposure, malnutrition, or abuse. Those who survive the journey face lives of unending labor and degradation. The systematic destruction of the city begins even while people are still being killed. Buildings are burned not just to smoke out hidden defenders, but to ensure that the city can never be used as a base for resistance again. Churches and temples are specifically targeted for destruction because they represent the spiritual and cultural identity of the population. Libraries and schools are burned with particular enthusiasm. Books and manuscripts that represent centuries of accumulated knowledge are used as fuel for fires. The attacking army wants to ensure that the conquered population loses not just their lives and property, but their history, culture, and ability to educate future generations. Artisans and craftsmen who might be valuable in other locations are sometimes kept alive but forced to work under slave conditions. Their skills are exploited for the benefit of the conquering army, but they're never allowed to return to their homes or practice their crafts for their own benefit. The wells and water sources are often poisoned or filled with bodies to ensure that anyone who might try to resettle the city won't be able to survive. The goal is to make the city uninhabitable for years or decades, a permanent reminder of what happens to communities that resist. Religious sites are desecrated in ways calculated to cause maximum psychological damage to survivors. Sacred objects are destroyed or used for profane purposes. Religious leaders are subjected to particular humiliation and torture before being killed. The message is that the gods of the conquered people are powerless, and the gods of the conquerors are supreme. Even the dead aren't spared. Bodies are mutilated, dismembered, and displayed in public areas to terrorize any survivors. Heads are mounted on spikes and placed where they'll be easily visible. Bodies are fed to animals or left to rot in the open as a reminder of the fate that awaits anyone who opposes the conquering army. The psychological impact of witnessing this systematic destruction is devastating for anyone who survives it. Survivors develop what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. But medieval people had no understanding of psychological trauma and no effective treatments for it. Survivors are left to cope with their trauma alone, often for the rest of their lives. But the assault phase of the siege, horrific as it is, usually lasts only a few days. The real challenge for survivors is what comes next, living in the aftermath of complete social and physical destruction. The immediate problem is medical. Many survivors are wounded and need treatment, but there are no medical facilities left functioning. The city's physicians are dead, their equipment destroyed, their supplies looted. Survivors have to treat their own injuries with whatever materials they can scavenge from the ruins. Infection becomes a major killer in the weeks following the assault. Wounds that might have been treatable with proper medical care become life-threatening when treated with dirty rags and contaminated water. Many people who survived the initial violence die days or weeks later from preventable infections. Food becomes an even more critical problem than it was during the siege itself. Whatever food supplies the city had left have been destroyed or looted. The attacking army takes anything edible for their own use. Survivors are left to forage among the ruins for anything that might be consumable. Water sources are often contaminated with blood, bodies, and debris from the assault. Survivors have to travel long distances to find clean water, or they have to drink contaminated water and risk disease. Many people die from waterborne illnesses in the aftermath of the assault. Shelter becomes nearly impossible to find. Most buildings have been damaged or destroyed, and those that remain standing are often unsafe due to structural damage. Survivors have to build makeshift shelters from rubble and debris, offering little protection from weather or further violence. The social challenges are even more difficult than the physical ones. Families have been separated, and many members have been killed, kidnapped, or sold into slavery. Survivors often don't know the fate of their loved ones and may spend years searching for family members or hoping for their return. Community structures that took generations to build have been completely destroyed. There are no governments, no courts, no schools, no religious institutions. Survivors have to rebuild not just buildings but entire social systems from scratch. Trust becomes almost impossible among survivors. The trauma of the assault, combined with the desperate competition for scarce resources, makes people suspicious of each other. Communities that once supported each other become collections of individuals focused solely on their own survival. Mental health problems are universal among survivors, but completely misunderstood by medieval medical knowledge. People who witness the assault develop intrusive memories, nightmares, and episodes of overwhelming fear. But these symptoms are interpreted as moral weakness, divine punishment, or possession by evil spirits. Children who survive the assault are particularly damaged. They've witnessed violence and trauma that no child should experience. And they've lost the stable family and community structures that children need for healthy development. Many become permanently damaged, unable to form normal relationships or function effectively in society. Women who survived sexual assault face not just the psychological trauma of their experiences, but social rejection from their own communities. Medieval societies often blamed women for sexual violence against them, assuming that they must have done something to provoke the attacks. Many women are rejected by their families and communities and forced to live as outcasts. The economic reconstruction of the city, if it happens at all, takes decades. The crafts and trades that supported the city's economy have been disrupted. The craftsmen are dead, their tools destroyed, their workshops burned. Even if survivors want to rebuild the economy, they don't have the skills or resources to do so effectively. Agriculture becomes nearly impossible because the countryside around the city has been devastated by months of siege warfare. Fields have been trampled, crops destroyed, farm animals killed or stolen. Even if survivors manage to plant new crops, they don't have the tools, seeds, or knowledge needed for successful farming. Trade relationships that took generations to establish have been completely severed. Merchants who once traded with the city are afraid to return, assuming that it's no longer safe or profitable. The city becomes isolated from the broader economic networks that once supported it. Some survivors choose to abandon the city entirely, becoming refugees who travel to other locations in search of safety and opportunity. But medieval societies weren't welcoming to refugees, especially refugees from cities that had been destroyed for resisting powerful armies. Many refugees are turned away from other cities or forced to live in marginal conditions on the outskirts of communities. Those who stay and try to rebuild the city face a multi-generational project. They have to not only rebuild the physical infrastructure, but also re-establish the social, economic, and cultural institutions that made the city function. Most never succeed in recreating what was lost. The psychological impact of surviving a medieval siege lasts for generations. Children who grew up in the ruined city pass their trauma to their own children. Stories of the siege become part of the community's oral history, shaping how future generations view conflict, authority, and the possibility of resistance. Some siege survivors develop a form of learned helplessness, becoming passive and submissive in the face of any authority. They've learned that resistance leads to destruction, so they never resist anything again, even when resistance might be justified or necessary. Others develop the opposite reaction, becoming hyper-vigilant and aggressive in response to any perceived threat. They've learned that safety is an illusion, and violence is always just below the surface of civilized society, so they prepare for conflict constantly. Religious faith is often shattered by siege experiences. People who believed that their gods would protect them have seen their cities destroyed, and their families slaughtered despite their prayers and devotion. Some become atheistic, while others develop obsessive religious practices designed to prevent future divine punishment. The economic legacy of a siege can last for centuries. Cities that were major commercial centers before sieges sometimes never recover their economic importance. Trade routes are rerouted around them. Economic activity relocates to safer locations. The city becomes a permanent reminder of what happens to communities that choose the wrong side in political conflicts. But perhaps the most lasting impact of a medieval siege is on the concept of home itself. Survivors lose not just their houses, but their sense that any place can be truly safe. The walls that were supposed to protect them became the walls of their prison. The community that was supposed to support them became a collection of competitors for scarce resources. Home becomes not a place of safety and belonging, but a reminder of vulnerability and loss. And here's the final, crushing irony of surviving a medieval siege. After everything you've endured, after all the starvation, disease, violence, and trauma, you probably won't live to see the city rebuild itself into anything resembling what it was before. The physical and psychological damage is too severe, the social and economic disruption too complete. You'll spend the rest of your shortened life in the ruins of your former community, surrounded by reminders of what you lost and what you could never recover. The siege ends not with victory or defeat, but with the complete transformation of everyone involved. The attackers move on to their next target, carrying their own psychological scars from months of warfare. The survivors remain, permanently changed by their experiences, trying to rebuild lives that can never be the same. And the city itself becomes a cautionary tale, a reminder to future generations of the consequences of resistance and the fragility of civilization. Other cities hear the story and choose submission over defiance. The siege serves its ultimate purpose, not just destroying one community, but terrorizing all the others into compliance. Medieval chroniclers sometimes wrote about sieges as if they were glorious affairs, tests of courage and faith that revealed the true character of the participants. But the reality was much more mundane and much more horrific. Sieges were slow-motion genocide, designed to break entire communities so completely that they could never pose a threat again. If you had somehow survived a medieval siege, you would understand something that most people in history never had to learn, that civilization is much more fragile than it appears, that the social contracts that hold communities together can dissolve in a matter of weeks, and that human beings are capable of both extraordinary resilience and breathtaking cruelty. You would understand that safety is always temporary, that walls can't protect you from every threat, and that sometimes the greatest dangers come not from outside enemies, but from the breakdown of your own community under stress. You would understand that survival often requires making choices that you never thought you would make, compromising values that you thought were absolute, and living with consequences that last far longer than the original crisis. And you would understand why medieval people feared sieges more than any other form of warfare, not because they were necessarily more deadly than battles, though they often were, but because they lasted long enough to change people in fundamental ways. Battles could be won or lost in a day. Sieges took months or years, and they changed everyone who experienced them. The next time you read about a medieval siege in a history book, or see one portrayed in a movie, remember that the quick, dramatic version you're seeing is not what actually happened. The real siege was months of slow starvation, gradual breakdown of sanitation and social order, epidemic disease, psychological warfare, and the complete transformation of a community into something unrecognizable. Remember that most of the people inside the walls never got to be heroes. They didn't die gloriously defending their city or dramatically escaping to fight another day. They died quietly from hunger, disease, or despair, forgotten by history and mourned only by people who were too busy trying not to die themselves to properly grieve. Remember that the walls that seemed so strong and protective were often more dangerous than the open countryside, because they trapped people inside with threats that multiplied and intensified over time. And remember that medieval warfare wasn't about quick victories or noble causes. It was about breaking communities so completely that they could never recover, terrorizing populations into submission and demonstrating that resistance to authority would be met with consequences that lasted for generations. You wouldn't survive a medieval siege, not because you lack courage or strength, but because medieval sieges were designed to be unsurvivable for most of the people who experienced them. They were exercises in systematic destruction that targeted not just military forces, but entire populations. The fact that anyone survived these experiences is a testament to human resilience. But the fact that the experiences were designed to be unsurvivable is a reminder of human cruelty. Medieval sieges represent both the worst and the best of human nature, often in the same people, often at the same time. So the next time you complain about modern inconveniences, remember the people who spent months eating bark and leather while listening to their neighbors die of dysentery, knowing that their own deaths were probably just days or weeks away. The next time you take clean water, abundant food, modern medicine, or peaceful communities for granted, remember that these things are historically unusual and geographically limited. Most people in history lived much closer to the edge of survival than we do, and most of them faced threats that we can barely imagine. And the next time you feel safe behind walls, whether literal or metaphorical, remember that walls can become prisons, that safety is always temporary, and that the greatest threats often come from within rather than without. Medieval sieges ended, but their lessons remain. They teach us about the fragility of civilization, the importance of community, the consequences of political decisions, and the resilience of human spirit in the face of unimaginable hardship. They also teach us to be grateful for the peaceful, prosperous, secure world that most of us inhabit today, and to work to preserve it for future generations who will face their own challenges and need their own forms of resilience. Because while you probably wouldn't survive a medieval siege, you are the descendant of people who did. Their survival made your existence possible. Their resilience is part of your heritage. Their stories are part of your history, and their reminder that civilization requires constant care, that communities require active participation, and that the good life requires vigilant protection is as relevant today as it was 700 years ago, when the last great medieval siege finally ended and the survivors emerged to rebuild their shattered world.